Hey, welcome to the Literary Lens podcast. This is the Murky Middle, the show where we discuss publishing issues for those mid-list authors. But I also think aspiring authors will find a lot of resources here so they can go into the industry with the right expectations, since a lot of people don't know what they're getting themselves into. I'm Lane Heymont, the president of the Tobias Literary Agency. I do horror and nonfiction and, some thriller, mystery, romance, run the gamut. Anne, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Anne Rose. I'm here at the Tobias Literary Agency where I represent middle grade, young adult, and selective adult titles. I am part of the adult department with Jacqui Lipton, who is to my left. I don't know if she is on your side, but she's to my left here. And I will pass it off to her.
Thanks. I'm Jacqui Lipton, and I head the adult department at Tobias, although I represent pretty much a little bit of everything from kid lit up through adult. I'm particularly interested in nonfiction in all of those age ranges, and in fiction, I like mystery, I like romance, I like sci-fi, I kind of like genre stuff, but, I also like a good solid literary piece as well. So I'm going to pass it to Kelly.
Yes, hello, I'm Kelly Dyksterhouse. I am only on the kidlit side. I rep everything from picture book to young adult novels, fiction and nonfiction, and a few illustrators as well.
Okay, before we started recording, Anne and I were having a fist fight because this is, like I said, for mid-list authors. So I said Anne should be the one to define what a mid-list author is. And She strongly objected and told me to go to hell.
I was objecting just because number one, you didn't give me fair warning. Like, why should I be the one just because I came up with the brilliant idea for this? Like,
that should be obvious. So, yeah.
So why do I have to define it? Like,
okay. So what do people think of when they hear the term mid-list author?
I think I often confuse mid-list and mid-career, and often it's the same thing. Like, often someone who is mid-career has had a fairly solid career as a mid-list author, which would mean someone who's solidly publishing and probably making a living on publishing and associated work like teaching and other stuff, editing. But I do think that's something that often gets conflated. So I'm curious as to what other people think.
I kind of had the same thoughts, which is why I asked that it be defined here at the beginning, what we're talking about.
So this is your fault, Kelly, is basically.
Sorry. Yeah.
But
I do think there's a difference because you can have a mid-list book and be a debut author.
Yes.
So I do think that's important to clarify. But I do think a lot of times the two are used kind of synonymously. I think when I'm thinking mid-list, I think it's actually an interesting term because it assumes then if you've got a middle, you assume the top, which you've got your breakout voice. But then that also assumes that there are books at the bottom of the list, and that's not a term. Like, there's no bottom list books. So you're either mid-list or you're a breakout author. Does that make sense? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think when we originally had started talking about like what we were going to do when we came to doing a podcast, I suggested doing like that mid-career author, just because I feel like there's so much stuff that's geared towards debuts, right? Like we do query, even us, we're going to do some query letter talk, because I do think that is important, right? But generally speaking, it's, all of the things that new authors are trying to do to break into the industry. But once you get into the industry, what does that mean, right? So you have an agent, you're here, now what are you going to do? But that's a really good point that you bring up, Kelly. And I think that they call the ones that are at the bottom, they call those authors that don't get book deals anymore, unfortunately.
It's funny because as soon as you said bottom list, I was like, have I ever had a bottom list book? And I think nothing starts out as a bottom list, but I definitely think publishers have torpedoed their own books or have literally never done anything. You publish a book and then it goes up into ether.
Well, but you can also publish a book and then the pandemic happens. So like I know of authors, you know, who got 6-figure book deals in 2019 and the book sold like 500 copies. You know, so is that successful or is that mid-list? They got a great advance and a lot of attention, but no one knew what was going on in March 2020. So you're right. I mean, the publisher can have a lot to do with how successful a book is, but sometimes stuff happens.
Those are those grand majeure clauses are for, right, Jacqui?
Yeah, but that doesn't make a book successful. That just excuses. By the way, I didn't introduce the fact that I am the legal nerd on this panel, and I can talk about how antitrust judges define different markets in the book industry, but that's probably not all that helpful for these purposes.
I mean, it could be later on.
Yeah, I'll keep it in reserve.
Good. And it's interesting you mentioned the pandemic because I had a client whose book literally came out like the first day of the pandemic in Los Angeles. And he had a big book launch at a big bookstore with A-list celebrities going to show up. And I got calls saying it has to be canceled. How dare you have this? It has to be canceled. I was like, all right, I guess that's canceled. And it was going to be a big, cool book. It is a big, cool book. It's got a film option. We're shopping it right now. You know, it's going to be a big, huge TV and we're going to make billions of dollars, knock on wood. But yeah, it got struck by the pandemic and that was no one's fault, you know, obviously, except, you know, no comment. But
yeah, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
What are you going to do when that happens, right? So has the book done well?
Yeah, I mean, it's done well. You know, he's a good author. We got him another deal. And once the TV show comes out, he's going to be a rock star. I mean, you know, he's what I would call a mid-list author.
Yeah.
But actually, I was having a conversation with a client this morning and, you know, I would describe her as a mid-list author. And one thing that came up that was really interesting, and maybe we'll have her on in a future podcast, is that she has a very successful platform, you know, that she has developed that she can rely on, and she's making a living with that platform. And we were talking about, are there areas in which she wants to extend? You know, what are the pros and cons of, and because I represent a little bit of everything, we were sort of looking at the options and we're saying, well, there's adult fiction, there's adult nonfiction, you know, she writes a lot in the kidlit side, but she does have a very specific comfort zone, and she also has a lot of credibility in nonfiction because of her background in science. And it turned out to be a really interesting cost-benefit analysis discussion because there's a lot of sort of resources that you as an author put into sort of shifting gears and developing a new kind of platform. And then that's taking away from what is solidly making you money. And I think it was a really interesting conversation because, I mean, those are really significant decisions that I think a lot of mid-list authors think about if they want to be thinking about, you know, can I break out with something in another space in the market? Well, what does that then take away from? So you know, time is a limited resource.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but I think too, like on the flip side of that though, like publishing takes so long, right? And because of that, for an author to be able to get to a point where they can make money and make a living off of their writing, they have to start looking for those other avenues in order to create that income to come in. So I have this conversation with my authors all the time. Like, yes, you write, you know, young adult, but you know, are there any other age groups or genres you're interested in? Because while we're shopping those, we could also be shopping other things. That's when, you know, those non-compete clauses, you know, we can get away with getting, you know, 2 books released within a year's period of time if necessary, and those kinds of things. So I think that's there's more of a conversation too to go along with that. It's to make it happen.
So I've run into this where I have a mid-list author who's established in, say, horror or romance, and they want to write something else. Say, horror author wants to write romance, which I literally have a horror author who's writing romance. Do they then become a debut author in that genre? Because that's what I've personally run into with editors saying, well, they're not established there, so we can't give you as much money, or it's a harder deal. I wonder if anyone else has run into that, or if I'm just getting, jerked around.
No, I think that's true, right? They don't have an established readership within that genre. It's not like they went from horror to thriller, right? Because there's a lot of crossover in those readerships, and I think you can make the argument that the readerships are there in those two genres that could very well intermingle, right? But horror to romance are very separate. That's like going from young adult to romance in some respects as well, which I know there's conversations that we could have about, how to mitigate and manage those kinds of things when you're a very well-established romance author and then you decide to start writing young adult books, for example. But,
by the way, I hope Starbucks is watching and wants to send us lots of coffee, because I'll take free coffee. Just
are you
FYI.
already gearing for what are those called when they sponsors?
Sponsor.
Well, if Starbucks wants to give us some money or free coffee, hell yeah.
And as you know, I will drink any amount of coffee. So anyone out there who wants to give us coffee, please.
Green Mountain, Dunkin' Donuts.
There's a 7 Brew across from my house, a Dutch Brothers that's down the street. I've got coffee, and I'll grind it too and just make it hot.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I don't have a grinder. Do you have a grinder? Is it difficult?
I have
No.
a grinder.
Grinder from the 70s. I have no idea. I think it was like dad's or something. You literally just pour it in and press the button and grind it.
Oh, they had electric grinders then? I wasn't.
Once they
grinding
invented
coffee
electricity in 1972, then yes, they did become.
Well, did they have electric can openers in the 70s?
I think so, yeah.
Now that's something, we'll have to have another episode on that. Figure it out.
I wasn't opening cans in the 70s, so I can't tell you for sure. It would have to be something I'd have to Google.
Well, you should have been. Okay, back to mid-list authors.
So,
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that they are a debut, and I think that you can treat it that way. And I don't think that being a debut is a bad thing, though. No. I think that that's also a selling point, because in some regards, it's like, well, they're an unknown. You can make them as great as you want to, publisher. So let's make that happen.
Ooh, that brings me to something that's super interesting, because I get that a lot for, when you get passes saying, oh, well, we can't break this out, or I don't know how to break it out. Yeah. Like, it's your job and you have the money. Oh, look at Entangled. They threw in $100,000 at Red Tower books, and all of a sudden they're everywhere.
I mean, I think that is the answer to that question, right? Like, the answer to the question of how do you break this out is money.
Money.
Yeah. Money.
It is the ultimate answer. I think really what that comes down to is, do they want to? And so that's why they're saying now, is that they don't want to throw the money at that. So, but the simple answer is yes. With enough money, you probably can make any book a bestseller. We would be happy to also be the test case in that situation as well. Don't you think, anyone? Publishers?
So I'm gonna have to cut out that part about Penguin Random House and Simon and Schuster.
Yeah.
The legal expert is.
I'm about to make a deal with Simon and Schuster on something, and I don't want them coming back and be like, hey, go fuck yourself.
Yeah, we can cut all the way through this.
Yes. At 14:31.
Okay, write it down. Who's got a pen? Kelly.
And I have 14:31. I got the pen. I'm good.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, I
think an interesting conversation here would be to talk a little bit about, and I've had this conversation with my clients before, kind of similar to Jacqui, what the conversation you were having with your client earlier. If my clients want to do something different, and break out from their normal mold, which I think is very possible. And actually, we encourage it these days. Is long gone are the days where, like, if you write fantasy, you're stuck writing fantasy for your entire career. And that is a great thing. But we do have a lot of conversation about your personal brand. And I think brand can have a huge umbrella outside of just genre. So if you do want to break out, just doing so within the understanding of the brand you've created and still working underneath that umbrella. Do you guys talk to your clients about those things at all?
Absolutely. I talked to Natasha about my brand because she always asks, what's your brand? I'm like, I have no idea. I like horror and I like nonfiction. But you're absolutely right when it comes to brands. Like Cynthia Palaio's brand is fairy tales. No matter what she writes, she likes writing about fairy tales.
I had a client actually emailed me this morning that talks about that very thing, Kelly. So what she did over the holidays is she created herself an author packet. And in her packet, it's about like who she is as an author, like what her brand is. And she writes some cozy fantasy. She writes some cozy mystery. She writes a little bit of, she has this other, a little bit more of a cozy fantasy, but her themes and general vibes in her books are very similar. And she's actually created this whole world that happens all the way on like the East Coast of fictional world that happens on the East Coast of the United States. So she has like a map of her towns and like where they're located and like how the stories are all somehow interconnected, even though they really don't rely on each other. So I think you're right. I think that when it comes down to it, there's a brand too behind who is telling the story.
Right.
And I love the package idea because there was a certain corporate mega agency that accidentally sent me one of their mega authors packets, and it really was an author packet about who they are, their previous books, their sales, their brands, and even a letter from this author. And I was like, oh, I should really steal that idea because that's a great idea. So I actually started doing that and do have some author packets. And, you know, some authors don't necessarily want it or don't necessarily need it because they're with their publisher and they want to stay with that publisher. Why bother?
Yeah, another thing I might throw in there, because it's a question I get asked a lot on the legal side, and it's a really simple question, is for people who want to do things like well outside their brand and really do want to reinvent themselves as a debut, this idea of using a pen name and setting up a separate persona for that. And that's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a good idea if it's going to sort of muddy the persona you've already created. It's not illegal. You have to sign contracts in your legal name, but you just mention that you're writing as so-and-so, and you can have a separate website. And I think a lot of people often feel that's like naughty and you're hiding who you are, but it can actually be a really good and very valid strategy for those situations where there's something you really want to write and you could be successful writing, but it's not going to sit comfortably with what you've developed to that point.
Yeah, it also helps with reader expectations as well.
Yeah.
Nora Roberts, she has like 35 different, pen names.
45.
Well, exactly 40, but she has a lot of pen names.
I have a client who she had a very, very successful career as a romance writer. And now she wants to turn to writing middle grade. Fun, very funny middle grade mysteries. And those two personas do not match. She does not want her middle grade parents and readers to Google her name and then find her, bodice ripping other books. So I think she's very smart in that respect to market herself under.
I think we probably all have clients like that. I can think of a couple, and I also think publishers probably don't want to hear this, so don't listen. But I mean, it's an easy kind of way to get around the non-compete. Like my cousin has a whole slew of pen names because she wanted to keep writing, and strict non-compete, and you publish under a different name and no one's the wiser unless you're Nora Roberts.
But bear in mind, and I'm just going to be the legal person here, that you still have to have your agent deal with that at the contract stage. So you're not tricking the agent and the publisher. They know who you really are. But when you have your non-compete clauses drafted, you put, you won't publish another book in your own name in this genre, and then you can get around the non-compete. But if your non-compete just says you won't publish another book, you then have to renegotiate that non-compete. So just keep that in mind, because I do have people who don't know how to approach an agent if they want to do something like that, and you just be transparent about it.
Absolutely. And I've been smart not to toot my own horn, but in non-competes, I always put in same world or similar characters or plot line. So, I mean, because, they tried and put in, same genre. Like, no, if I have a horror writer, you can't keep them from writing another horror for 15 years. More like 2 years, but still.
Right.
I would also add to smart, I would also say it's responsible. Because I think that a lot of times when there's been times, and I'm not going to name names, but there's, some adult writers that have, broken into YA. And then as a parent, it's just like, well, do I want my young adult then Googling their name and find those bodice rippers? Is that a responsible thing to do as an author, to allow that to happen? Like, yes, you're selling another book, but is that teen who just enjoyed that sweet whatever you wrote, also, are they really ready for that Regency bodice?
They've probably read it already. Let's be honest about it. I have teenagers.
It's true. I mean, that's true. I was actually talking to one of my son's friends last night about an adult romance novel that she has read. So that is fair, but I think it's responsible of an author to make sure that, if they're seeking them out, then yes, they're going to read them. But if they're not actively seeking them out and just happen to, oh my God, I love Bob Smith, they're my favorite writer in the whole world, and they just Google and then they find, and they're like,
it's a strictly romance thing, because the examples I keep hearing is romance.
Yeah. It's like, go ahead. I don't think so, because I mean, erotica is a very specific category that people might be worried about, and that often gets conflated with romance generally. But I do think it can be. I mean, there's lots of reasons. This is not exactly the same thing, but I used to write short stories under a pen name years ago because I also work as a law professor. And I write case books, and if I'm prescribing a case book that I'm a co-author on for a course I'm teaching, and I was writing sci-fi short stories. It's kind of like, why do I want my students looking for that? That's not really the responsibility question Anna's talking about. But
so what's that pen name?
Oh, never mind. I don't think anything's available anymore under the pen name anyway. But I think, the main concern, I mean, yes, obviously sexually explicit things are concerning, but violence, some nonfiction might actually be very graphic in some respects, and it might not be good. I mean, look, young children can get on the internet and can find anything. I do think romance, particularly when it leans into the erotica area, is the main concern, but I do think there's other areas, and I encourage authors to be thoughtful about all of this stuff at the beginning, because how you start is often how you have to keep going. Like if you establish a genre under a pen name, it's then very hard to change that once you're successful. So like I was just having this conversation with a debut author on my list who does write under a pen name just for privacy reasons, and has gone back and forth about, well, if this book is successful and if there's a sequel, do I want people to know it's really me or not? And that's really a decision you sort of have to make up front, because you can go on your website and say so-and-so and change your brand, but it's a lot of work. So I really think whether you're just starting out or whether you're established and you're changing direction or adding a new genre, think about it up front, because, you know, you never know what the cost will be to change tack down the line.
I think it's being intentional.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about everything ahead. Like when we're building a submission list, I'll ask a client, like, hey, are there any editors you dislike or particularly like? Because I've submitted to editors and all of a sudden clients are like, yeah, that person hates my guts. And I'm like, oh, okay. I wish I had known that.
Okay, I haven't run into that.
I'm an eclectic list.
I have had a client get really angry with me for asking if they had any editors that they wanted to send to. So
Really?
yeah, I did just once. And I kind of meant it as like in the way that you're talking about, like, you know, let me know if there's any editors that you're really excited to work with, that kind of thing. Like, you know, just let me know. It's I feel like it's an author's career, and so they should have a say in it. And this author like internalized that and took it as I was asking them to do the research for like who to submit it to, and that wasn't at all the case. You know, it was more of a, you know, hey, just let me know if there's anyone out there that just like catches your eye, like I'd really love to work with this editor, or I really would not like to work with this editor. And they just were really, really mad that I even suggested.
Interesting.
Interesting, because I always ask that. Just, you know, do you have any dream editors or dream houses? You know, it's always good to have dreams and goals, and you know, sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they're like, no, I don't really pay attention to that. That's your job, and I'm like, that's great.
And sometimes, you know, authors are like best friends with an editor, and I'll say, hey, I submitted to John Jingleheimer, and they're like, oh yeah, it's my brother. Like, okay, I wish I had known that.
Yeah.
That would have been good information.
Yeah. Which is why when I sign people, I say, you know, tell me everything. You know, if Obama ever shook your hand, tell me, and I'll decide if it's important.
Well, that is important.
Actually, that gets me thinking about another thing that, I mean, maybe both mid-list and beginning authors, but we're now sort of talking a little bit about the agent-author relationship and sort of the kind of input that the clients have with agents and editors. And I'm pretty transparent and open about those things, because ultimately I'm a lawyer. Ultimately, you know, we're fiduciaries. We owe that obligation of transparency to our clients. But that said, you know, I think one thing for mid-list authors, and here I'm getting at people who've been in the business for a while and have like more than one book out, although often it's an author with one book out, the industry does change and expectations change. And I think one thing to sustain and enhance a mid-list career is to really be open and alert to changes. And if you trust your agent, and ideally you should, you know, to sort of listen to what they're telling you. I mean, one big change, and this is not a secret to anyone, it's all over social media, that has been for years, is that editors rely more on agents to do a lot of editing than was the case 5 years ago. Okay, that's just, it is how it is. So if you have a client who's used to being able to send things out that are sort of less well cooked, in the hope that, well, the editor will really love it and they'll just work on it, that's less true today, you know, than it was 5 years ago. And I think to kind of sustain a career, you know, the general notion is, well, be easy to work with, be open, listen to what your agent and your editor is saying to you. And if you don't trust your agent or editor, move on to someone you do trust. But be really alert to those changes, because it's heartbreaking to, you know, not be able to sort of continue on a path just because something has changed and you're sort of stuck in the, well, it always used to be like this. I just send my idea to my editor and that's what, you know, it's like, no, that's not going to work now. So I think that is something for particularly mid-list authors to think about.
That's a super good point, because I have mid-list authors who, you know, they had a bunch of books done well, were shopping a new book, and one example is I got fired because I told someone I need a synopsis. And they said, well, I've never done that. I just sent it to my editor. I'm like, well, if you want to ship it to other publishers, I need a synopsis because they're going to ask me for the synopsis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I mean, synopses are horrible. Everyone hates them. But like you said, things had changed. And even a couple years ago when I was selling, editors would make an offer like that and not have to talk to the client and not have to talk about edits. But now even current clients with their current editor, the editor says, well, I want to talk to them about this and see where their headed is at. And like you said, it's all just, play nice, nod your head, smile. But yeah, I mean, the market has changed, I think, with shrinking advances and paper shortages and so many people writing. It's just gotten harder out there.
It's supply and demand at its basic core, right? There's more people writing, and so there's more supply, meaning, it gives editors the ability to say, okay, well, I can just wait till the next best, fairy story about mermaids comes across my desk, right? Because it's bound to happen, right?
Yeah.
Well,
And
I
it
think
affects
I'm
us
hearing.
too, because I've had to pass on projects and authors that I'm like, oh, I love this. It's going to be on shelves in 6 figures, but I just don't have the time. Or, I'm in the middle of contracts.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing, and I've talked to some of my mid-career authors about this is not an industry where you can just coast, right? You have to keep doing, as an author, the things that you did at the beginning of your career, with continuing to work on your craft and make those connections. And, just, you can't just rest on your laurels. You've got to continue. Now, I mean, I'm not saying you have to continue going to the early beginning conferences that you did, but going to some conferences is still good. Making those connections and developing your network. I think maybe pinpointing the things about that at the beginning of your career that you really loved doing and continuing those, because that's how you really keep your finger on the pulse of the industry and what's changing and what's not as well.
And agents, and I know editors have to do the same thing because, when I started, however many years ago, a good percentage of those editors are gone.
Yeah.
People.
That's actually a huge challenge for mid-career and mid-list people, the editors moving on, because it happens. And the days of, having these really close relationships with a particular editor and staying there. I mean, I was honestly, and this was for some legal work I was doing, but I was honestly looking at sort of the amount of layoffs and retirements the big publishers saw in 2023 alone, just in that 1 year. Chances are that half to 2/3 of people with established relationships with editors lost those relationships because the editor left, or had the relationship impacted because that editor had to take on a whole bunch of projects from other editors who left. And that is something I think, I know I cut you off, Lane, and I'm sorry, but I
completely forgot what I was saying.
Oh, well, now I've messed it all up. But I do think it's really, really important, because those figures are very significant of the changes in editors. And to the extent that an established author is just assuming that's going to continue long term, and this goes to your point about your client who you want to send something out wide when they're used to working with the same editor, well, as soon as you do that, you need the synopsis, and you need to convince a whole new acquisitions team at a whole new house to buy the book. It's almost like being a debut again.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, because Thomas Doherty Associates, Thomas Doherty left. So they had to totally rename the publisher. And I've had clients, and it's been a struggle, who have lost 2 or 3 editors in a year because low pay, hard work. With the pandemic, people just move on, and instead of making 40 grand a year publishing, they're making 200 grand a year in IT.
Yep.
Well, I would like to know where these 200 grand in IT jobs are, but
my sister-in-law makes a lot of money. She's in IT, and I'm like, man, I wish I wasn't stupid and could code, because there's a lot of money in that coding.
Okay, coding. Now that's a little different than just IT, or we're just that's just.
But what do you consider? What do
Yeah, like if you can't relate to the
I guess there's it's just like in publishing, there's lots of different branches in IT and like what you can do and securities and coding and programming and analytics and so
metadata, whatever,
all
you
the
know.
See, I'm in kidlit world. I hear the word code and I immediately start thinking spies. And then I just start getting excited. I'm like, where's the heist? Where's the bad guy? Show me the, and then I hear, oh, math, numbers, computers, and my eyes glaze over.
Well,
So,
if you're a lawyer, you'd think of the United States Code and all the statutory laws, and copyright is Title 17 of the United States Code, which is what I spend a lot of time thinking about.
I think of Knights of Salamnia from Dragonlance, but that's because I'm a nerd. So I'm curious, Kelly, you mentioned spies and thrillers and middle grade. Is that hot right now? Because I always think of middle grade as, I mean, I don't necessarily do middle grade. I do horror with middle grade protagonists, and sold as middle grade. But I mean,
yeah. If it's well written, I think there will always be room for good spies and good heists and good adventures. Actually, I've got 2 books right behind me who randomly have the word spies in their title. So that I read over break. Yeah, at least they'll always be big in my book. Yeah,
I agree.
so
okay. So for midlist advances, this is
let's talk money.
Let's
do
it. Are we
I get
jumping?
asked about a lot, saying, how much should I expect? And I feel like a failure saying, I don't know, bro. I mean, do we think midlist comes with a certain advance? Or I wonder if that's a way someone would think of midlist versus high list, front list, or the new term bottom list.
Thanks, Kelly.
So I mean, 50,000, is that mid list or is that front list?
I think it's going to depend greatly on who is publishing, right? That's the first thing. Like where have they published at before? What are their sales numbers? Those kinds of things. I think what's more important than trying to like pinpoint an exact number on a scale is like, where did you start and how can we bring you up from there? Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's better to look at in those respects. I think every book should get you more.
Yes. And that's something else I think mid-list authors should know, because I've had some that say, oh, well, a lower advance or the same advance is fine. And I have to say, no, the advance always goes up. It should be never going down or staying the same, because we don't want you to stay stagnant. That's part of it. We want you to get more and more money.
But what about your earlier question about switching genres and then are you a debut again? How does that then affect the advance?
That's also a good question, because I think you do have, at some point, you do take a cut, because I mean, publishers are super duper risk adverse, but in some sense they are taking a bigger risk, not a bigger risk, but a risk. And I think it's only fair that we be reasonable. And, if you've written 1,000 fantasy books and get $200,000 a fantasy book, if you come in with a romance, I mean, you're not going to get the same amount of money. And I don't necessarily think you should, because if you publish a romance for big bucks and then the romance sells 10 copies, that really, I think, pardon my French, fucks with your numbers.
Yeah.
I think we keep picking on romance authors here, but romance authors are amazing, and they are the bread and butter of our industry. So.
And I started out representing romance. I still have a whole bunch of romance authors. Romance, I think, is really great because you can do like Harlequin series and make a great career because, you know, they're 50,000 words and you write those. And I have a lot of clients and have had clients. I still get royalties from clients who published Harlequin series, I don't know, 10 years ago.
Actually, I might at this point round back to the antitrust decision, the case in October, November 22. The decision was handed down where Judge Pan in the DC court upheld the DOJ's attempt to block the Penguin Random House Simon & Schuster merger. And on that, how much advance should you want? Reading that case is a tremendous education in how publishers make these money decisions, because the judge goes through all the evidence that the publishers submitted about what they consider a bestseller, what they consider, and a lot of this was in the definition of market for the antitrust claim. So that's why they were doing that in the case. But there's a fascinating part of the judgment where the publishers are saying, really, the market that we should be looking at in this case is what, I can't remember the term they used, but it's like bestsellers. It's like the top sellers. And these are the books that get over $1 million advances, and they're all celebrities and politicians. And the case actually settled on defining the market for the antitrust case as authors who get $250,000 advances or above. Now, to me, that's not a mid-list author. You know, to me, that's significantly more than a standard mid-list author gets, but that was the market that the case defined as the one that would be harmed, where authors would be harmed at the point of if the merger went through. But there's a lot of other great information in that case, and there's graphs that are simple to follow that really talk about how the publishers make these money decisions. And you can get a copy of the judgment online, and maybe we can link it with the podcast if anyone wants to read it. But it's
not to cut you off, but I am cutting you off because that is such a great, fantastic idea. And I think everyone should read it. We should be reading. I went through, you know, I'm a dummy, so I went through like a couple pages, the, you know, big breakout stuff. But I think authors should be reading that. And that is a fantastic idea to go through it on the podcast, especially with you, because you're the lawyer, that I think there's a lot of great info in there. And I've used that to fix up, you know, payment structures where they say, oh, well, we have to pay out in eighths because of the pandemic. And I come back and say, well, that's not true, because in court, this is what was said.
Yeah, it's very useful, and the publishing paid me document that is still floating around online, that's very useful too. I've actually, the reason I'm looking at all this info so closely is I wrote an article that is going to come out in the Pittsburgh Law Review in a year or so, where I was looking at this kind of issue and how it impacts whose voices are published. So if that article comes out, or when it comes out, I'll put a link somewhere and people can read it.
Yeah, congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it would be cool if we could just make everyone get $250,000 as an advance.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Right? I wish we could go in and say, hey, is this author mid-list? And they'll be like, yeah, they're the mid-list. I'm like, okay, give us $250,000 right there. You said it yourself.
I mean, that's what the definition is then. I mean, for me to argue with that definition.
Or are you calling my client a bottom list?
Well, to be fair, I don't think the court called that mid-list, but that was where they felt the line should be drawn to decide, you know, whether there was an antitrust violation or not. So there is, you know, I can't remember the term they used, but certainly the way the court looked at the market was looking at much bigger money figures than I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis as an agent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think every author gets $350,000 a book deal.
Well, definitely not picture book authors, but if you can convince me of how to do that, I'd be all down for it.
And I also think it's good to think about mid-list authors when it comes to agents, because that's quote unquote also our bread and butter.
Right.
Because, you know, especially at our agency, we like a quality over quantity. So we're looking for books that we can break out or that we think are going to break out. And even books that, you know, I think may not break out or aren't for everyone. The mid-list authors and the high advanced authors help us be able to work on those and sell those. It's very much like the film industry. You know, they put out 10 Marvel movies to cover 300 indie movies they know are going to lose big money.
Right.
I mean, but some of those movies, they, like, you know, but some of them just shouldn't be made. But, you know, that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's always something that shouldn't be made. Maybe even this podcast. Maybe someone should be like, shut the hell up. We don't want to listen to you.
Yeah.
But actually, you know, one other point, and I think this is a misconception. I might be wrong about how widespread this misconception is, but one other thing I'd raise is a lot of authors I've seen, I probably should spend less time on social media, but, you know, on social media, there's a lot of complaint about how come this book got all this money. Often it's, you know, a celebrity book or a book the publishers put a lot of money behind, and my book didn't. And I think that's very much a misconception, because I think mid-list authors actually aren't competing with those books. You know, those books enable, you know, other books to be published. I think what mid-list authors are competing with is backlist. Because the publishers have the decision of how many new books do I purchase versus how much can I keep. You know, obviously there need to be some new books, but how's backlist doing? And, you know, I would think about it, or I would encourage people to think about it more in those terms than how come, you know, Prince Harry gets $1 million and I don't get anything. That's not really, that's really a false equivalency.
It's a really good point.
And I shut down the conversation by saying that.
No, not at all. I'm just thinking, because that's a very good point. Because, you know, I've sold to publishers who say, oh, we give smaller advances, but that's so royalties earn out faster. And, you know, you maybe say that's bullshit, but it really is that, you know, we've gotten larger advances that will never earn out just because it's usually the nature of the beast. But like the Harlequins that are, you know, $4, $5, $6 a pop, those earn out in a month. And then for the next 30 years, however often, I'm getting $100, $300, even with, you know, no advanced publishers that we do 50-50 splits with. I can make over a year more than I would have ever gotten as an advance.
Yeah,
I think though too, it will still depend on how much the publisher is helping to push that book and getting it out there in front of those readers. Because there are plenty of cases where, you know, a publisher puts out a book, you know, it does their thing, whatever they do behind the scenes, and then they just kind of like let it ride. And so,
yeah, I mean, like with the HarperCollins union strike, that really affected a lot of book releases.
Yeah.
And actually, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we probably could do an entire episode on just that.
Oh, write that down. We should, because I remember, I mean, pro-union, but you know, there's always collateral damage.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's the floor or a couple books.
And actually, one thing I wanted to add on to the, you know, how much resources the publisher puts behind making the book a success. This may be more for beginning authors, but it might also be for mid-list authors who are kind of reinventing or working with a new publisher. You are not going to find the marketing and publicity plan in your publishing contract, because that's something that is, it's going to happen later, and it's subject to all the stuff we've been talking about, COVID, union action, whatever it may be. But it is worth having that conversation with your editor and the marketing team. And I'm often more impressed with, say, a publisher, even with a smaller advance, who will get on a call with me and the client and talk about, here's what we're going to do, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do for the book, here's how we're going to be behind it. Now, of course, that's not contractually binding, but you do get a sense of what's possible and realistic, and you can have your questions answered. So I do want to raise that, because I think people need to understand it's a discussion that you should ideally have, but you can't expect it to be written in the contract.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah,
too,
I've had a bunch of clients want stuff written in the contract like that, because, an editor will tell us something. And I say, listen, I mean, we have it in email. We have some quote unquote legal standing, but no one's going to put that in a contract. It's just, not something they can promise.
I think another point to make, just to be beyond that, is that a lot of things that the publisher does to push a book, we don't see, right? And I think that is a huge complaint a lot of times from authors, is that, well, my publisher's not doing anything to sell my book. But the reality is that these marketing publicists, like they're busting their butts out there. Like they're doing the best they can to get their books seen and get their books on shelves in stores and do all of the things with the very minimal time that they've been given for each of these things. So mass respect to all the marketing and publicity teams out there that do all the things that don't get the credit that they well deserve. But that kind of is just a side way that just, even though you can't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? It doesn't mean it's not happening. So I think that too, having those meetings are really important, just to kind of get a better understanding. And I think if we could get more transparency in publishing overall, I think that would help out a lot of authors, and in that feeling of, I am not getting the support that I'm looking for.
And actually, maybe we could have an editor on a future, or maybe not an editor, a marketing person on a future podcast, and just talk about, the things they do, like sending the review copies and, sending the awards copies and all that stuff that they're, promoting authors as someone who could write a blog post about this, that, or the other. So that has to be on our list.
Absolutely. I was actually thinking I'm going to have Joe Monty on at some point, because he and I ended up having a 30-minute discussion about The Thing. And, he was very honest. And I think he's the type of guy who no bullshit. And like you were saying, Anne, I think editors push a lot too. Obviously, I mean, I've heard from other editors and people who I've literally never met saying, oh, yeah, I heard about this book. I love this book. It's so fantastic. And I'm like, oh, how'd you hear about it? And they're like, your editor told me. They've been telling everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that something that a lot of mid-career authors do know that debuts don't is sometimes you just have to ask for things, and you don't always get it. But even by asking, it lets your editor and your marketing and publicity team know that you're following, you're engaged, you're willing to participate and be a good, responsible partner in promoting your work. And sometimes you get it. Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We'll get this out. And other times, it's we can't help you there, but thanks for letting us know. But it never hurts to ask.
And by the same token, tell people what you're doing. Like, right. I write my book about law for authors, and if I'm doing something, I tell my publisher, because occasionally they have wanted to put it on their website or put it on their social. So, it's a two-way conversation. And if you're someone, I agree with you, you should ask, and you should ask nicely and not in a demanding way. Right. But it's also much more balanced and pleasant when you do ask, if you're also letting them know what you're doing and saying, hey, I did this interview. Here's a link to it if you want it.
Absolutely. And I have to tell clients to let me know, like CC me on everything, so I know what's going on. Like I have to give a shout out to Jenny Kiefer, because she's a marketing whiz, and her book, This Wretched Valley, is coming out 2
Love
weeks.
that cover.
The
Love
16th,
it.
right? It's a gorgeous cover. And she has, she started her own bookstore. And because it's about mountaineering, she has all these carabiners with, the book stuff. And I was kind of like, yeah, you got to give me like 30 of them.
Yeah.
Like, I want those, And there's this phone number that if you call, it's, you're listening to all the people get murdered. And she did a bunch of
It is scary.
No, it's not scary at all.
That's scary. It's a little bit.
It's just getting murdered. It's no big deal.
No, they're not getting murdered. I don't know what you're talking about.
They're not really getting murdered.
No, I don't know where you got that from. That's crazy.
Are you?
I'm just going to gaslight you. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
no, you're just gaslighting.
You never heard it. I never said that. I don't know where that came from.
Watch, he edits it out. Like, see, I told you I didn't say it.
Oh, that's a good idea. You can edit it.
We know the truth, Lane. We know.
I won't, obviously, because it's very funny. Back to mid-list authors. What were we talking about? There was something great I thought someone said.
Well, we were talking about authors engaging with the publisher, both in asking for support and in letting them know what they're doing. And then you said, of course, they should be telling their agents too, which we really appreciate because we can help boost stuff.
Yes, and Jenny's been very good about keeping me on the marketing because, I learn a lot from her because she's amazing and knows marketing. But, maybe I'll have a random idea to throw in there. I don't think I have, but, if for some reason I come up with an ingenious idea that's going to make us millions of dollars, I'll be able to throw it in there.
I mean, I know that I'm always on the lookout for things. So if I see someone who does a call out and like is looking for, authors for a podcast, I'll send it to my authors. If, I hear of an opportunity, whatever it may be, you probably are the same way. Like you're always kind of have your feelers out there at all times, just kind of like checking it out. Like you're in the bookstore and you hear, I wish there was a middle grade mystery that, did you hear about the Curious League of Detectives and Thieves by Tom Fell? I mean, you're always trying to jump in there and find opportunities for your client. At least I know I do that all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's something authors also don't see. They don't see what the publisher is doing behind the scenes. They don't see what we're doing behind the scenes. I mean, we're always working. Every time I'm talking to a producer, I'm pitching a project from 10 years ago that I know a client cares about. I've been pitching the same project to 30 different producers 10 different times, and it hasn't clicked, but it'll click with someone and then we'll be billionaires.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was randomly at a comic book store over the holidays, and they had a section of books that was just prose novels. They weren't graphic novels. And so I brought up a conversation. I was like, hey, what makes you decide which prose novels to stock here? And so of course then I throw in there, my client's book would fit right here in this, and they wrote it down. And so, I mean, are they going to buy 100,000 copies? Probably not, but still it's introducing a new store to my client's work. And then hopefully a new reader will find them from that. So
on that note, it's funny because whenever I go to a bookstore, I'll buy whatever client's book is there. And I'll be like, yeah, I sold that book. And they're like, oh, what do you mean? I'm like, I sold it to the publisher, so you should order a bunch more books. And they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe we will. I'm like, nah, you should. Come on, you want to do it. Like, put it in right now. I want to see you type it in your little computer. If only I had the cojones to actually do that, but.
Well, everyone who follows me on any social media knows that if I'm always looking for my client books at bookstores and libraries. I always take shelfies and post them on social media and tell everyone to buy them because, it is exciting for us. Like, I don't know if this is the same at all agencies, but we're kind of a nice size that we all know who the clients are and who reps who, and we meet every week and talk about projects, and we're very excited when people do well and their books are out there. So that's something I remember seeing a book that I worked really hard on, and it was, really important to me. And the first time I saw it on the shelf in Barnes and Noble, I literally jumped up and down in the store. I don't think I've ever done that in my life, but I was literally jumping with joy.
I think that's also something authors may not know, that we're all always hunting the shelves for their book.
Yeah.
We may not take pictures of it, but just, being a small part of bringing that thing to life is magical.
Yeah.
Oh, I always hunt for books, my authors and your authors, and every time I find them, I put them face out on the shelf.
Yeah, I do that.
It's so funny. I do the same thing.
I have so many videos that I've sent to my family and friends of me laughing and just moving the book so it's face out.
Yep.
Or to the author. Anyway, it's very exciting when we see the product of a lot of hard work.
Okay, so we reached the 1 hour point, which means we're going to cut out, and then, for the next hour, it'll be for sponsors, people who sign up for Patreon, the bonus episode. So let me do this outro. I actually wrote it out, so hopefully it sounds good. Thanks for joining us for the Murky Middle on the Literary Lens podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, or join our Patreon. We appreciate all the support. When you sign up for our Patreon, you get access to early episodes, bonus episodes, access to our Discord, which I think is super cool, and the chance to win a prize each week. Prizes are gift cards, ARCs, even limited signed edition books, which I think is super cool. Again, shout out to Jenny Kiefer's This Wretched Valley, which comes out the 16th. It's a survival horror in the vein of the Dilatov Pass meets Yellow Jackets, which is like the most amazing show ever. Also check out New York Times bestselling author Suzanne Young's Writing in Italy retreat at writinginitaly.com. I went last year and it was the most magical trip ever. I even brought back some pasta and sent Anne some pasta. Did you actually eat the pasta yet? No? No. I had to smuggle it through customs and fight off a bunch of dragons.
And the box that it came in was so big. I was like, oh my gosh, how much pasta did you see? It was giant. It was this giant box.
I don't even remember. That's funny. That sounds like something I would do. Anyway, so we'll post all those links in the description. And if you signed up for our Patreon,